I found the text messages on a Tuesday night. 3 words that would destroy everything I thought I knew. I miss you. The woman my husband was texting wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a coworker. She was the person who knew me better than anyone on earth, my twin sister. What I did next, nobody saw coming. Not my husband, not my sister, and certainly not the entire town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. This is the true story of betrayal, revenge, and a twist that changed 3 lives forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How long had this been going on? Did anyone else know? What would you do if this happened to you? Because what started as a perfect marriage became a psychological war. And when you hear what happened in the end, you'll understand why this story went viral. Stay with me, because nothing about this story is what it seems. For the next duty minutes, you're going to witness something that sounds impossible. A story so twisted, you'll question everything you know about trust. Allison and Rachel Parker, identical twins, born 3 minutes apart in Millbrook General Hospital. You couldn't tell them apart unless you knew them. Growing up, they were inseparable, finished each other's sentences, wore matching outfits until they were 16. Their mother used to say they shared one soul between 2 bodies, but somewhere between childhood and adulthood, things changed. Rachel was the wild one, the risk-taker. The sister who'd sneak out at 2 in the morning and charm her way out of trouble. Allison was different, careful, responsible. The sister their parents never had to worry about. But here what nobody saw. Beneath the twin bond was competition, for attention, for love, for validation. And that competition was about to turn into something none of them could have imagined. When they were 7 years old, Allison won the school spelling bee. Rachel came in second place. Their mother hugged Allison first. Rachel noticed. When they were 14, Allison made varsity basketball. Rachel didn't make the cut. The coach praised Allison's dedication. Rachel heard every word from the bleachers. When they were 17, Allison got accepted to nursing school with a full scholarship. Rachel's application was rejected. Their father threw Allison a celebration dinner. Rachel sat at the table, fork in hand, smiling through clenched teeth. These weren't isolated moments. They were a pattern, a lifetime of watching someone who looked exactly like you succeed while you struggled, a lifetime of hearing people say, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" A lifetime of feeling like the rough draft while Allison was the finished product. But Rachel learned to hide it well. She became the fun twin, the spontaneous one, the sister who showed up with wine and gossip and made everyone laugh. She dated men who were wrong for her and shrugged it off when they left. She worked retail jobs and told everyone she was still figuring out her path. She stayed close to Allison because that's what twins do. They stay close, even when one of them is slowly suffocating under the weight of comparison. Even when one of them is learning to resent the face she sees in the mirror, because it reminds her of everything she's not. Allison, for her part, genuinely loved her sister. She didn't see the competition. She saw her best friend, her other half. When Rachel struggled, Allison tried to help. She'd offer advice, lend money, make introductions to potential employers. She meant well. But every act of kindness felt like charity to Rachel. Every offer of help was a reminder of the gap between them. And Rachel began to wonder, what would it feel like to have something Allison wanted? What would it feel like to be chosen first for once in her life? She didn't know the answer to that question. Not yet, but she was about to find out. Dylan Cooper walked into Allison's life on a fall evening at a friend's engagement party. 32 years old, contractor, built houses with his hands, the kind of guy who fixed things. He had an easy smile and a quiet confidence that made people feel safe around him. He wasn't flashy, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just Dylan, and Allison noticed him immediately. She watched him across the room, laughing with a group of guys, beer in hand, completely unaware that someone was studying him. She wasn't usually bold, wasn't the type to make the first move, but something about Dylan made her want to try. She walked over, made a joke about the terrible DJ. Dylan laughed, a real laugh that reached his eyes. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, favorite movies, worst jobs they'd ever had, whether pineapple belongs on pizza. And somewhere in that conversation, Allison felt something shift, a door opening, a possibility. Dylan asked for her number. She gave it to him without hesitation. He texted her the next morning. "Good morning. Last night was fun. Want to grab coffee?" 3 sentences that started everything. Their first date was at a small cafe on Main Street. Allison wore a blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Dylan showed up 5 minutes early, nervous energy barely contained. They talked for 3 hours. About family, about dreams, about the things that scared them and the things that made them feel alive. Allison told him about nursing school, about her patients, about the satisfaction of helping someone through their worst day. Dylan told her about building homes, about the pride of handing keys to a family, about wanting to create something that would last. They didn't run out of things to say. They didn't check their phones. When the cafe closed, they walked through downtown Millbrook, talking under streetlights, laughing at inside jokes that were already forming. By the third date, Dylan kissed her goodnight on her front porch. By the sixth date, he told her she was the best thing that had happened to him in years. By the 10th date, Allison knew she was falling in love. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she let go. She let herself believe in the fairy tale. She let herself imagine a future with this man who looked at her like she was the only person in the room. She let herself be vulnerable, and it felt terrifying, and wonderful, and real. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Dylan proposed on a Saturday morning in the kitchen while Allison was making pancakes. No fancy restaurant, no grand gesture, just Dylan getting down on one knee in sweatpants, holding a ring he'd saved for months to buy, asking her to marry him with tears in his eyes. Allison said yes before he finished the question. She called Rachel immediately, screaming with joy, crying, telling her twin sister that she'd found him. The one. Rachel listened, congratulated her, said all the right things. And when she hung up the phone, she sat alone in her apartment and stared at the wall for an hour. The wedding was beautiful, small ceremony, close friends and family only. Allison wore their grandmother's veil. Rachel was the maid of honor. She helped Allison get dressed, zipped up the gown, fixed her hair when a strand came loose. She stood beside her sister at the altar and held her bouquet while Allison and Dylan exchanged vows. She gave a speech at the reception, talked about growing up with Allison, about how they used to pretend to be each other to confuse their teachers, about how Allison had always been the brave one, the strong one, the one who knew exactly what she wanted. She said Dylan was lucky, that Allison deserved every happiness in the world, and she meant it. At least part of her meant it. But there was another part, a small, ugly part that Rachel tried to ignore. The part that watched Dylan look at Allison like she hung the moon and wondered what that felt like. The part that noticed how gentle he was with her, how patient, how attentive. The part that thought, just once, I want someone to look at me like that. Just once, I want to be the one someone chooses. And that thought, that tiny seed of envy, was planted. It would take time to grow, but it was there, waiting. For 3 years, Allison and Dylan's marriage looked perfect. Sunday brunches at the local diner where they knew the waitress by name. Weekend camping trips to state parks where Dylan would build the fire and Allison would read books in a folding chair. Plans to start a family once they'd saved enough for a down payment on a bigger house. They had routines, traditions, a rhythm to their lives that felt stable and safe. Dylan would leave for work at 6 in the morning, kissing Allison goodbye while she was still half asleep. She'd work 12-hour shifts at the hospital, come home exhausted, and find Dylan had left dinner in the oven with a note. Miss you. Love you, see you tonight. They weren't perfect. They argued about money sometimes, about whose turn it was to clean the bathroom, about whether to visit his parents or hers for Christmas. But they always worked it out, always came back to each other, always chose love over being right. And Rachel was always around. The cool aunt, even though there were no kids yet. The fun sister-in-law. The third wheel who never felt like a third wheel. Dylan would joke that marrying Allison meant he got 2 Parkers for the price of 1. Rachel would laugh and pour herself another glass of wine and pretend that joke didn't sting. She'd show up on Friday nights for game night. Help Dylan with home improvement projects on weekends when Allison was working. Join them for barbecues and birthday parties and movie marathons. She was family. Nobody thought it was weird. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? But looking back, Allison would remember little things. The way Rachel touched Dylan's shoulder when she laughed at his jokes. How she always volunteered to help him paint the guest room when Allison had a double shift. The perfume she started wearing, something woodsy and warm, the same scent Dylan had once mentioned he liked on Allison. The way Rachel would text Dylan directly instead of going through Allison. Just small things. Hey, did you finish that project? Want me to pick up supplies? Netflix recommendations. Memes that made her think of him. Innocent messages, friendly messages, the kind of messages you send to family. At least that's what Allison told herself, because trust is a funny thing. When you love someone, you ignore the red flags, you explain them away, you tell yourself you're being paranoid. You remind yourself that this is your sister, your twin, the person who's been by your side since before you were born. She would never hurt you. Right. Wrong. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what Rachel would later claim. Dylan needed help moving furniture one Saturday while Allison was pulling a weekend shift. Rachel came over, they moved the couch, rearranged the living room, ordered pizza, watched a movie while they waited for delivery. Nothing inappropriate, nothing wrong. Just two people who cared about Allison spending time together. But somewhere between the pizza and the movie something changed. A look that lasted too long. A moment when their hands touched reaching for the remote. A awareness that they were alone, that Allison wouldn't be home for hours, that they were sitting too close on the couch. Dylan pulled away first, made an excuse about needing to finish something in the garage. Rachel left shortly after, and for a few days they didn't talk, both of them knowing something had shifted but neither willing to name it. But avoidance only works for so long. Rachel came over the next week. Different excuse, forgot her jacket. Dylan answered the door. They stood in the entryway, awkward small talk filling the silence. And then Rachel said it. I can't stop thinking about last weekend. Dylan should have shut it down, should have told her to leave. Should have called Allison right then and confessed that her sister had crossed a line, but he didn't. Instead, he said, me neither. And that was all it took. 2 words, me neither. Permission granted, boundary crossed, affair begun. They told themselves it was a one-time thing, a mistake, something that happened in a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But 1 time became 2, 2 became 10, 10 became a pattern. They developed a system. Allison's work schedule became their roadmap. When she had night shifts, Rachel would come over. When she had overnight rotations, they'd meet at a cheap motel 2 towns over. They used burner phones, deleted messages, coordinated their stories. They became experts at deception. At looking Allison in the eye and lying. At sitting at the dinner table together, all 3 of them, pretending everything was normal while carrying the weight of betrayal between them. And the worst part, they fell in love. It wasn't just physical. It wasn't just forbidden attraction or the thrill of sneaking around. They genuinely developed feelings for each other. Dylan started to see Rachel differently, not as Allison's sister but as her own person. Fun, spontaneous, free in ways Allison wasn't. Rachel made him laugh, made him feel young. Didn't nag him about saving money or being responsible. She was easy, uncomplicated, everything he didn't realize he'd been craving. And Rachel, for the first time in her life, felt chosen. Dylan didn't see her as second best, didn't compare her to Allison. With him, she was enough, more than enough. She was wanted, desired, loved, and that feeling was intoxicating. But guilt has a way of eating people alive. Dylan started drinking more, coming home from work and pouring whiskey before dinner, snapping at Allison over nothing, pulling away during intimacy, making excuses to avoid family gatherings. Allison noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd ask him what was wrong. He'd say work was stressful. She'd offer to help. He'd say he just needed space. She'd give it to him, and the distance between them grew. Rachel noticed too. The guilt in her twin's eyes when she hugged her. The way Allison would mention feeling lonely even though she was married. The jokes about Dylan being distant lately. And Rachel would sit there, drinking wine in her sister's kitchen, offering relationship advice while sleeping with her husband. The compartmentalization required was staggering. the cognitive dissonance, the ability to love someone and destroy them at the same time. 6 months into the affair, Dylan made a decision. He wanted to leave Allison, wanted to be with Rachel openly, build a life with her. He told Rachel one night in the motel room. She was terrified, excited, conflicted. What about Allison, she'd asked. Dylan had looked at her with those eyes that made her feel chosen and said, "We'll tell her together, we'll be honest. She'll be hurt, but she'll move on. People do." Rachel wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe there was a version of this story where everyone would eventually be okay, where she could have what she wanted without completely destroying her sister. But deep down, she knew better. Deep down, she knew this would detonate everything. And she agreed anyway. But leaving a marriage isn't simple, especially when there are assets involved. A house, joint bank accounts, shared debt. Dylan started planning, started thinking about how to untangle his life from Allison without leaving himself broke. He talked to a buddy who'd gone through a divorce, asked questions, learned about asset protection, about moving money before filing papers, about making sure he didn't get screwed. And that's when the plan got darker, because Dylan wasn't just thinking about leaving. He was thinking about taking everything with him. Started small, cash withdrawals, 500 here, 1,000 there. Nothing Allison would notice immediately. He opened a separate account at a different bank, started redirecting his paychecks. 50% to the joint account, 50% to the secret one. He told Allison business was slow. They needed to tighten the budget. She believed him. Started picking up extra shifts to compensate, working herself to exhaustion while Dylan siphoned their future into an account she didn't know existed. And Rachel, she knew, she watched him do it, helped him forge Allison's signature on a few documents, told herself they'd pay Allison back eventually, once they were settled, once the dust cleared, once the guilt didn't feel so suffocating. By the time Dylan had moved $70,000, Allison still had no idea. She trusted him, trusted that they were partners, that he'd never do anything to hurt her, that the man she'd married was still the man who'd proposed in the kitchen over pancakes. But people change. Or maybe they just reveal who they were all along when the right circumstances arise. Dylan had convinced himself this was fair, that he'd earned this money, built the business himself. That Allison would be fine because she had her nursing career. She didn't need him, but Rachel did, and he wanted to give her the life she deserved, the life she'd been denied while watching everyone else succeed. He saw himself as her savior, her hero, the man who finally chose her first. He didn't see himself as a thief, as a liar, as someone about to commit fraud. He saw himself as in love. Christmas was coming. Dylan and Rachel picked the date, Christmas Eve. Allison would be visiting her parents 3 hours away. Dylan would claim he had to work. They'd empty the remaining accounts, book flights to Mexico City, disappear before anyone could stop them, start over somewhere warm where nobody knew their names or their story. It was perfect, clean, simple, and it would have worked. If Allison hadn't come home early that Tuesday night in November, if Dylan's phone hadn't been sitting on the counter, if that one text message hadn't lit up the screen at the exact moment Allison walked into the kitchen. "I miss you." 3 words. That's all it took. Allison stood there staring at Dylan's phone, her mind trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A heart emoji contact name. No actual name, just a red heart. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone, unlocked it. His password was her birthday. The irony wasn't lost on her later. She opened the messages, scrolled up, and watched her entire world collapse in real time. Months of messages. "I can't stop thinking about you. When is she working next? Last night was perfect. I love you." That last one broke something fundamental inside her. "I love you." Dylan had said those words to someone else. Someone he was texting on the phone she'd bought him for his birthday. Someone who knew Allison's work schedule. Someone who'd been in their home, in their bed. She kept scrolling, looking for clues, and then she saw it, a photo. Rachel's distinctive rose tattoo on her wrist, visible in a picture that was clearly taken in their guest bedroom. The room Rachel had helped Dylan paint. The room where Allison's sister had apparently been sleeping with her husband. Allison's knees went weak. She sat down hard on a kitchen chair, phone still in hand, mind racing through every interaction. Every Friday game night, every helpful gesture, every "I love you, sis." Every moment had been a lie. Her husband was cheating with her twin sister. The two people she trusted most in the world had been betraying her for months, maybe longer, and she'd been too blind, too trusting, too stupidly optimistic to see it. She heard the shower turn off upstairs. Dylan would be down in 5 minutes. She had to decide, confront him now, scream, cry, throw things, demand answers, or do something else. Something her shattered heart was already calculating even as tears streamed down her face. She thought about Rachel, about every time Rachel had come in second, about the resentment that must have been building for years, about how this betrayal wasn't random. It was targeted, calculated. A lifetime of jealousy finally finding its outlet, and Allison realized something that would define everything that came next. Rachel hadn't just stolen her husband, she'd been trying to steal her life, her happiness, her sense of security, everything Allison had built. And if Allison screamed and cried and fell apart right now, Rachel would win. Dylan would comfort her. They'd paint Allison as the hysterical wife. They'd be the victims of her anger. They'd probably be together within months, telling people that the marriage was already over, that they'd found real love, that sometimes these things just happen. Allison wiped her eyes, put Dylan's phone back exactly where it had been, walked upstairs to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed and made a decision. She wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She wasn't going to be the crazy ex-wife. She was going to be something much worse. She was going to let them think they'd won. And then she was going to destroy them both in a way they'd never see coming. Because Allison Parker wasn't just a nurse. She was a woman who'd spent years dealing with life and death situations, who stayed calm under pressure, who knew how to read people, how to plan, how to execute, and she'd just been handed the motivation to use every skill she possessed. Dylan came downstairs, hair wet from the shower, completely oblivious. He kissed Allison on the forehead, asked about her day. She smiled, said it was fine, long, tiring. He made them dinner, pasta, her favorite. They ate together at the table, made small talk. He told her about a job site problem. She listened, nodded, asked appropriate questions. When he reached across the table to hold her hand, she didn't pull away. She squeezed back, looked him in the eyes, and lied as easily as he'd been lying to her. Because that's what you do when you're playing chess while everyone else thinks you're playing checkers. You smile, you nod, you make them feel safe, and you plan your next 10 moves while they're still celebrating their last one. That night after Dylan fell asleep, Allison went downstairs, opened her laptop, and started researching. Infidelity, divorce law, asset protection, fraud. She read for hours, took notes, created spreadsheets. By sunrise, she had the outline of a plan. It wasn't complete, wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She'd need evidence, documentation, proof of everything, not just the affair, the money too, because as she'd scrolled through Dylan's messages, she'd seen references to accounts, to plans, to Mexico, and she'd realized this wasn't just an affair. This was theft, conspiracy, multiple felonies, and if she played this right, she wouldn't just divorce them, she'd put them in prison. For the next 3 weeks, Allison played the perfect wife. She had sex with Dylan, initiated it even. She knew it was manipulation, knew she was creating a false sense of security, but she didn't care. This wasn't about morality anymore. This was about survival, about justice, about making sure that when this was over, everyone knew exactly who the victims and villains were. She texted Rachel regularly, sent her funny memes, made plans for their monthly sister lunch, acted like everything was completely normal. Rachel responded enthusiastically. No guilt, no hesitation, just casual conversation with the sister whose life she was actively destroying. The cognitive dissonance was stunning, and it told Allison everything she needed to know about who Rachel really was. Meanwhile, Allison hired a private investigator, paid cash, met him in a parking lot like something out of a crime show. She gave him Dylan and Rachel's information, their routines. The motel she'd found receipts for hidden in Dylan's truck. The investigator was good. Within a week he had photos, time-stamped, dated. Dylan and Rachel entering motel room 214 on a Thursday afternoon. The same Thursday Allison had been working a double shift. They looked happy in the photos, relaxed. Rachel's hand in Dylan's back pocket, his arm around her shoulders. They looked like a couple, because they were. And Allison stared at those photos until she felt nothing, until the grief transformed into something colder, something sharper, something that would serve her better in the war ahead. But the affair wasn't enough. Allison needed the financial evidence. She accessed their joint bank account, started downloading statements, 6 months back, a year, 2 years. She highlighted every suspicious withdrawal, every transfer that didn't make sense, and she found the pattern, thousands of dollars, gone. She called the bank, pretended she'd forgotten the name of their other account, the one Dylan had mentioned. The helpful customer service rep checked, told her they only had one account registered to both names. Allison's blood went cold. Dylan had opened a secret account, which meant he'd forged her signature on documents, which meant this wasn't just an affair. This was premeditated financial fraud. This was a felony, and Allison had him. She contacted a forensic accountant next, showed him the statements, the withdrawals, asked if this constituted fraud. The accountant, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd clearly seen every kind of financial betrayal, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Ma'am, if he forged your signature to open accounts and move marital assets without your knowledge, that's bank fraud. That's identity theft. That's federal prison time if prosecuted." Allison asked how much evidence she'd need. The accountant laid it out, copies of the forged documents, proof the account existed, proof of the transfers, timeline of when the money was moved, testimony about her lack of knowledge. It was doable, all of it. She just needed to be patient, methodical. She needed to let Dylan keep going, keep stealing, keep documenting his own crimes. Because the more evidence she gathered, the stronger her case became. And Allison was nothing if not patient. Thanksgiving came. Both families gathered at Allison and Dylan's house. Rachel helped cook the turkey. Dylan carved it. Everyone held hands and said what they were grateful for. Allison said she was grateful for family, for the people in this room who meant everything to her. Rachel and Dylan both agreed, grateful for family, for love, for second chances. Allison's father made a toast. To the Parker twins, he said, "May you always be as close as you are today." Everyone raised their glasses. Rachel and Dylan exchanged a quick glance. Allison saw it, filed it away, added it to the evidence, because everything was evidence now, every lie, every moment of deception. Every time they looked at her and pretended to care while planning her destruction. She was building a case, and they were the star witnesses against themselves. After Thanksgiving, Allison made an appointment with a lawyer, not a divorce lawyer, a criminal defense attorney, someone who understood fraud, someone who could advise her on how to protect herself, how to document everything correctly, how to work with law enforcement if it came to that. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen, listened to Allison's story without interrupting. When Allison finished, Margaret sat back in her chair and said, "You have two options. File for divorce now with what you have, walk away with half of what's left and move on with your life. Or you can keep documenting, build an ironclad case and pursue criminal charges. But I need to warn you, if you go the criminal route, this will get ugly. This will be public. Your sister will go to prison. Your husband will go to prison, and you'll have to testify. You'll have to relive all of this in court, in front of strangers. In front of the media probably, because twin sister affairs make headlines. Are you prepared for that?" Allison didn't hesitate. She looked Margaret in the eyes and said, "I want them to pay for everything they've done. Not just to me, for every lie, every theft, every moment they sat in my home and pretended to care while planning to rob me. I want consequences, real ones." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we build the case, but you have to be smart. You have to stay calm. You can't tip them off. Can you do that? Can you keep living with him, knowing what you know, until we have everything we need?" Allison thought about Dylan sleeping beside her every night, about Rachel texting her about Christmas plans, about the performance she'd been giving for weeks, and she said, "Yes, I can do that." Because the version of Allison who would have fallen apart, who would have confronted them immediately, who would have let emotion guide her decisions, that Allison died the night she found those text messages. The woman sitting in Margaret's office was someone new, someone harder. someone capable of things the old Allison never would have considered. Margaret outlined the plan. Keep copies of everything. Bank statements, text messages, photos, create a timeline, document every interaction. If Dylan mentions anything about leaving, about Mexico, record it. Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state. You can legally record conversations without the other person knowing. Get him to talk about the money, about the affair, about his plans. And whatever you do, don't confront Rachel yet. Let her keep thinking she's getting away with it. Allison took notes, asked questions, and when she left Margaret's office 2 hours later, she had a roadmap, a strategy, a way to turn her pain into power. The next week, Allison did something that would later be described as either brilliant or psychotic, depending on who you asked. She planted seeds. Small suggestions dropped casually into conversation. She mentioned to Rachel over coffee that she'd been thinking about taking a vacation, somewhere tropical, maybe Mexico. Rachel's eyes had lit up. "Mexico's beautiful," she'd said. "You should totally go." And Allison had smiled and said, "Maybe Dylan and I will plan something for next year, when we have more money saved." Rachel had nodded, sipped her latte, and texted Dylan 10 minutes later suggesting Mexico as their destination. Allison knew because the private investigator was monitoring Rachel's phone too now. Every text, every call, all of it documented, all of it building toward the inevitable conclusion. Allison also started making it easier for Dylan to steal. She removed the security alerts on their bank account, told him she was tired of getting notifications for every transaction. He seemed relieved, started withdrawing larger amounts, got bolder. Allison documented every withdrawal, every transfer, watched the secret account balance grow, watched him steal her future right in front of her, and she felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just cold calculation. Because she'd learned something important in those weeks of performing normalcy while planning revenge. Emotion was a liability. Detachment was power. And she was done being the emotional one. Done being the wife who cried and begged and tried to fix things. She was becoming something else entirely. December arrived. Holiday decorations went up around Millbrook. Allison and Dylan bought a Christmas tree together, decorated it while drinking hot chocolate and listening to carols. Rachel came over to help. The three of them strung lights and hung ornaments and took photos that Allison would later look at and marvel at her own ability to smile while planning their destruction. Because that's what she was doing. Every moment, every interaction. She was setting the stage for the final act. And they had no idea. They thought they were so smart, so careful. They thought Allison was clueless, the devoted wife and sister who'd never suspect, who trusted blindly, who loved unconditionally. They'd mistaken her kindness for weakness, her trust for stupidity, and they were about to learn the difference. Christmas Eve, the day Dylan and Rachel had chosen for their escape. Allison's parents expected her for dinner at 3. It was a 3-hour drive. She'd normally leave by noon. But this year Allison told them she'd be there late, 8 or 9 probably. Work had been crazy. She needed to sleep in. Her mother had been disappointed but understanding. Allison had felt guilty about lying to her parents, but this was necessary because she needed to be in Millbrook, needed to watch what happened next. Needed to see the look on their faces when everything fell apart. Dylan kissed her goodbye that morning, told her to drive safe, said he'd miss her. Allison had hugged him tight, breathing in his familiar scent, memorizing the feeling of his arms around her because this was the last time. The last moment before he knew she knew, before their marriage officially ended, before he became not her husband but a defendant. She pulled back, looked him in the eyes, and said, "I love you." He said it back, "I love you too," and she wondered if he meant it. If any part of him still cared, or if those words had become as hollow as everything else between them. She left, got in her car, drove to the end of the street, and parked. She rented a different car the day before. Something Dylan wouldn't recognize. It was parked 2 blocks away. She walked to it, got in, and drove back to a spot where she could see their house without being seen. The private investigator was already there, set up across the street with a camera. He nodded to her when she arrived, and they waited. At 11:15, Rachel's car pulled into the driveway. She went inside. Allison watched through binoculars as Rachel and Dylan moved through the house. She couldn't see details, but she could see enough. They were packing, loading things into Dylan's truck, working quickly, efficiently, like they'd practiced this. And maybe they had. At 12:30 they left the house together. Dylan locked the door. Rachel got in the passenger seat of his truck. They pulled out of the driveway. The investigator followed at a distance. Allison followed him. They drove to the bank. Dylan went inside alone, was inside for 20 minutes, came out with a large envelope. They drove to Rachel's apartment. Both went inside, came out an hour later with suitcases. Allison's heart was pounding. This was it. They were actually doing it. Actually going through with the plan to rob her and disappear. Part of her had hoped they'd back out, change their minds, prove her wrong. But they didn't. They were exactly who she discovered them to be. And that knowledge, that confirmation, hardened the last soft part of her heart. They drove to a motel on Highway 9. The same motel the investigator had photographed them at before, checked into a room. And for 2 hours Allison sat in the rental car and imagined what they were doing in there. Celebrating probably, congratulating themselves on pulling it off, making love like they didn't have a care in the world. Maybe Rachel was texting Allison right now. Some casual message about Christmas plans, some lie to cover her tracks. Allison checked her phone. Sure enough. A text from Rachel. "Hey sis, hope you're having fun with mom and dad. Love you." Allison stared at those words. Love you. From the woman who'd been sleeping with her husband, who'd helped him steal $73,000, who was currently in a motel room planning their escape. Love you. The audacity was breathtaking. At 4 p.m., Dylan and Rachel left the motel, drove to a grocery store, bought champagne, supplies for the road. They were smiling. Allison could see them through the store windows, happy, relaxed, free. They thought they'd made it, thought the hard part was over. They had no idea that Allison had already contacted the bank, had already filed a fraud report, had already provided evidence of Dylan's forgeries, had already alerted federal authorities, had already ensured that when they tried to board that flight tomorrow morning, they'd be met by agents instead of flight attendants. They had no idea that every step they were taking was one step closer to prison. Allison followed them back to the motel, watched them carry groceries inside, and then she drove away, went to her parents' house, walked in at 6 p.m. Her mother hugged her, asked why she looked tired. Allison said work had been exhausting, sat down for dinner, made conversation, pretended everything was fine because she was good at that now, pretending she learned from the best, from Dylan and Rachel. They taught her how to smile while your world is ending. How to say I love you while planning someone's destruction. How to sit at a table with people who trust you and lie straight to their faces. She'd been an excellent student, and tomorrow they'd see just how well she'd learned. Christmas morning. Dylan and Rachel woke up in the motel, got dressed, checked out, drove to Philadelphia International Airport. They arrived at 6 a.m., 3 hours before their flight, plenty of time. They checked their bags, 2 suitcases each, everything they owned that mattered. Dylan had his laptop. Rachel had jewelry, they had cash, credit cards, new identities they'd bought online. They'd thought of everything, except the possibility that Allison already knew, that she'd been 10 steps ahead the entire time. That she'd spent the last 6 weeks building a case that would bury them both. They made it through ticketing. The agent had been friendly, wished them a Merry Christmas. They went through security. Dylan's hands were shaking slightly. Rachel noticed, squeezed his hand. "We made it," she whispered. He smiled, kissed her. They walked to their gate. Gate B-17, flight to Mexico City. Departure time 9:15 a.m. They sat down in the waiting area. Rachel bought coffee. Dylan checked his phone one last time. No messages from Allison. She must be sleeping in at her parents' house. Probably wouldn't even notice he was gone until this afternoon. By then, they'd be in the air. By tonight, they'd be in Mexico. By next week, they'd be untraceable. They'd planned everything perfectly. Except they hadn't. Because at 9 a.m., 30 minutes before boarding, 4 federal agents approached them in the gate area. Dylan Cooper and Rachel Parker, the lead agent, said, "You need to come with us." Dylan's face went white. Rachel started to stand, started to run, but there was nowhere to go. Passengers were starring. Phones were out, recording. The agents weren't rough, didn't need to be. Dylan and Rachel were too shocked to resist. They were escorted out of the gate area, through the terminal. People watching, whispering. Someone recognized Rachel from Millbrook, posted about it on social media. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. Local contractor and twin sister arrested at airport on federal charges. The town that thought it knew everything about the Parker twins was about to learn the truth. Dylan and Rachel were taken to separate interrogation rooms. Read their rights. Asked if they wanted lawyers, both said yes. Both called the same attorney because they only knew one between them. The attorney arrived 3 hours later, listened to the charges: bank fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, looked at the evidence the prosecution was willing to share, and told them both the same thing: you're going to prison. The only question is for how long. The attorney explained that someone had been documenting everything. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every forged signature. They had timestamps, photos, bank records, phone records, a paper trail so complete that defending against it would be impossible. Who, Dylan had asked. Who did this? And the attorney had looked at him with something like pity and said, your wife. Rachel broke first, started crying, hyperventilating. This can't be happening. Allison doesn't know, she can't know, but she did know, had known for weeks, had watched them, documented them, set them up perfectly. The attorney asked Rachel if she wanted to cooperate, give testimony against Dylan in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rachel hesitated, looked at the attorney with mascara running down her face and asked how reduced. The attorney made a call, came back. If you testify, if you provide everything you know about Dylan's financial crimes, prosecution is willing to offer 3 years instead of 10. Rachel thought about it for maybe 30 seconds. And then she said yes. Because that's who Rachel was. When things got hard, she saved herself, just like she'd always done. Dylan found out about Rachel's cooperation 2 hours later. His attorney delivered the news. Your girlfriend is testifying against you. She's taking a plea deal. Dylan had sat there in stunned silence, and then he'd asked the question that would haunt him for years. Does Allison know? About everything. The attorney nodded. She's the one who reported you. She's been working with investigators for weeks. She has evidence you don't even know exists. Dylan put his head in his hands. And for the first time since the airport, he cried. Not because he was going to prison, but because he'd underestimated the woman he'd promised to love forever. Because he'd mistaken her kindness for weakness. Because he'd thought he was smarter than her. And he'd been so catastrophically wrong. The arraignment happened the next day. Both Dylan and Rachel were denied bail, flight risk. They'd literally been arrested trying to flee the country. The judge wasn't sympathetic. They were taken to county jail to await trial. And that's when the media really got involved. Twin sisters, affair, fraud. It was tabloid gold. Local news covered it, then regional, then national. Within 48 hours, Dylan and Rachel's mugshots were on cable news. Talk shows were discussing it. Social media was having a field day. And Allison, who'd been staying at her parents' house, had to watch her private nightmare become public entertainment. Her mother was devastated. How could Rachel do this? How could we not see it? Allison's father was furious, wanted to visit Rachel in jail, wanted to scream at her. Allison told him not to, told him Rachel wasn't worth it, but inside Allison was breaking. Because as satisfying as it had been to watch them get arrested, as justified as she felt in her actions, it didn't erase the pain, didn't undo the betrayal, didn't make her marriage real again or her sister trustworthy again. It just meant she was alone now, truly alone. The two people who'd known her best had chosen to destroy her, and even though they were facing consequences, even though justice was being served, Allison had to live with the fact that she'd been that easily betrayed, that the people who claimed to love her had been capable of such calculated cruelty, and that knowledge, that wound, would never fully heal. Trial was set for March, 3 months away. Dylan's attorney tried to get the charges reduced, argued that Dylan had been planning to return the money eventually, that this was a domestic dispute, not a criminal matter. The prosecution, armed with Allison's documentation, shut that down immediately. This was systematic theft, forged signatures on legal documents. intent to flee the country with stolen assets. This was exactly what federal fraud laws were designed to prosecute. The judge agreed. Trial would proceed on all counts. Rachel, having taken her plea deal, would testify for the prosecution, against her former lover, against the man she'd claimed to be in love with just weeks earlier. Because Rachel's love, like everything else about her, was conditional, based on what served her best in the moment. In January, Allison met with the prosecution team. They wanted to prepare her for testimony, wanted to walk her through what questions would be asked, how Dylan's defense would try to discredit her. The lead prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s named Jennifer Walsh, sat across from Allison in a conference room and said, "They're going to try to paint you as a scorned woman seeking revenge. They're going to argue that you manipulated evidence, that you entrapped them, that you're just as guilty of deception as they are, and you need to be prepared for that. You need to stay calm, stick to the facts. Don't let them make you emotional. Can you do that?" Allison thought about the last 2 months, about the performance she'd given, about sitting across from Dylan at breakfast and pretending everything was fine, about hugging Rachel and wishing her Merry Christmas while knowing she'd be arrested the next day, about the ice that had replaced her heart somewhere along the way. And she looked at Jennifer and said, "I can do that," because emotion was what they expected, tears, anger, a breakdown on the stand, but Allison wasn't going to give them that. She was going to be exactly what she'd been since November: cold, calculated, unbreakable, the prosecution's perfect witness. February brought an unexpected development. Rachel's attorney reached out to Allison through Margaret Chen. Rachel wanted to talk, off the record, just the two of them. Margaret advised against it. Nothing good can come from that conversation, she'd said, but Allison was curious, wanted to hear what Rachel possibly had to say after everything, so she agreed. They met at the county jail, in a visiting room with cameras but no audio recording. Rachel looked terrible. Jail had not been kind to her. No makeup, hair pulled back, orange jumpsuit. She looked small, broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd walked into the airport 2 months ago. Rachel spoke first. "I'm sorry." Allison didn't respond, just stared at her. Rachel continued, "I know sorry doesn't fix anything. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I need you to understand it wasn't about hurting you." Allison laughed, actually laughed. A cold, bitter sound. Rachel flinched. "It wasn't about hurting me. You slept with my husband, helped him steal from me, planned to disappear and leave me with nothing. But it wasn't about hurting me." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "It was about him, about finally feeling chosen, about not being the twin who came in second for once in my life." And Allison felt something shift, because she'd spent months being angry at the betrayal. But hearing Rachel try to justify it, hearing her make herself the victim, sparked something new. Not anger, disgust. "You've always been the victim, haven't you, Rachel?" Allison's voice was quiet, controlled. "Every accomplishment I had you made about yourself, about how it made you feel, about how unfair it was that I succeeded. It never occurred to you that maybe I worked harder, maybe I sacrificed, maybe I earned what I got instead of just expecting it to be handed to me. You wanted my life so badly you decided to take it, and when you got caught you couldn't even own it. You blamed me, said I manipulated you. Made yourself the victim again. You're going to prison, Rachel, not because I'm vindictive, but because you committed crimes. And I hope every day you spend there you think about the fact that you did this to yourself, that nobody made you sleep with Dylan, nobody made you help him steal. You chose this. Own it." Rachel was sobbing now. Allison stood up, started to leave. Rachel called after her, "We're sisters. We shared a womb. Doesn't that mean anything?" Allison stopped, turned back, and said something she'd been holding in for months. "We were sisters, past tense. The moment you decided my husband was more important than our bond, you stopped being my sister. You're just a stranger who happens to share my DNA. And I feel nothing for you except pity. Because you threw away the person who loved you most in this world for a man who's testifying against you to save himself. Oh wait, that's you. You're testifying against him, so I guess you deserve each other after all." And she walked out, didn't look back, didn't feel guilty, just felt the final thread of connection between them snap, and it was liberating. The trial began on March 15th. The courtroom was packed, media, curious locals, court watchers who followed high-profile cases. Allison sat in the front row, wore a navy suit, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She looked professional, composed, the opposite of what Dylan's defense wanted. They wanted to paint her as unstable, vengeful, but she gave them nothing to work with, just sat there, calm, watching as her life was dissected in front of strangers. Opening statements laid out the case. Prosecution painted Dylan as a calculating thief who'd systematically defrauded his wife with the help of her sister. Defense argued that Dylan had been in a failing marriage, that he'd panicked, that he'd made mistakes but never intended permanent harm, that he'd been planning to return the money, that Allison had manipulated the situation, had entrapped him, had known about the affair and used it to frame him. It was a desperate strategy. But it was all they had. The prosecution called their first witness, the bank manager who'd helped Allison uncover the secret account. He testified about the forged signatures, about the account Dylan had opened using Allison's information without her knowledge. Cross-examination tried to suggest Allison might have known, might have given permission, but the bank manager was certain. Mrs. Cooper was shocked when I told her about this account. She had no idea it existed. Next came the forensic accountant. He walked the jury through every withdrawal, every transfer, showed the pattern, the escalation, the clear intent to hide assets. Cross-examination got nowhere. Then came the private investigator. He presented photos, timestamps, documentation of Dylan and Rachel's meetings, the motel, the airport, the luggage, the tickets to Mexico. It was damning, comprehensive. Defense tried to argue invasion of privacy. Judge shut it down. Mrs. Cooper had every right to investigate suspected fraud in her marriage. Next witness was the attorney Dylan had consulted about divorce, the one he'd asked about asset protection. The attorney testified reluctantly. Attorney-client privilege had limits when crimes were involved. He confirmed that Dylan had asked specifically about moving money before filing for divorce, about how to hide assets, about Mexico's extradition policies. The jury looked at Dylan. He looked at the table. Day 3 brought Rachel to the stand. She looked better than she had in jail. Defense attorney had made sure of that. Hair styled, makeup. A civilian outfit the jail allowed for court appearances. She looked sympathetic, young, scared, exactly what her plea deal required. Jennifer Walsh approached her, asked her to state her name. Rachel Parker asked her to identify the defendant. Rachel pointed at Dylan, wouldn't look him in the eyes. Jennifer asked her to describe her relationship with Dylan Cooper. And Rachel told the truth, all of it, how the affair started, how long it lasted, how they'd planned to leave together, how Dylan had asked for her help moving money, how she'd forged Allison's signature on documents, how they'd bought tickets to Mexico, how they'd been celebrating in the motel before their flight. Every word was a nail in Dylan's coffin. Cross-examination tried to make Rachel the mastermind, suggested she'd seduced Dylan, manipulated him. Rachel stuck to her script, said she took responsibility for her actions, that she'd been wrong, that she'd betrayed her sister, but that Dylan had been the one planning the financial fraud. She just helped. The distinction mattered, made her complicit but not the architect, made Dylan the primary criminal. It was effective testimony, devastating. And when Rachel stepped down, Dylan's attorney looked defeated. Day 4 was Allison's turn. She walked to the stand, swore to tell the truth, sat down, looked directly at the jury, not at Dylan. Jennifer Walsh smiled at her, asked her to state her name. Allison Marie Parker Cooper asked her to identify her husband. Allison pointed at Dylan, still didn't look at him. Jennifer walked her through everything. The discovery of the texts, the decision not to confront immediately, the investigation, the documentation, the fraud report, the coordination with authorities. Allison answered every question calmly, factually, no emotion, just a recitation of events. Then came the question that mattered. Mrs. Cooper, why didn't you confront your husband when you discovered the affair? Allison looked at the jury, said, because I realized it wasn't just an affair. When I looked through the messages, I saw references to money, to Mexico, to plans I knew nothing about. And I realized that if I confronted them, they'd just lie, gaslight me, make me question what I'd seen. I needed evidence, proof. I needed to protect myself. Because the people I trusted most had already shown they were willing to destroy me. I wasn't going to give them another opportunity. Defense cross-examined, tried to rattle her. Isn't it true that you manipulated your sister into this affair? No. Isn't it true you wanted revenge? No, I wanted justice. Isn't it true you planted evidence? No, I documented crimes. Isn't it true you're a scorned woman who can't accept that your marriage was over? My marriage was over the moment my husband decided to betray me. But that didn't give him the right to steal from me. Every answer was measured, controlled. The defense attorney got frustrated, tried to provoke her. You seem awfully calm for someone whose life was destroyed. Allison looked at him, said, I've had months to process this. I've cried, I've grieved. But I'm not going to break down in front of you because that's what you want. That's what would fit your narrative of the unstable wife. But I'm not unstable. I'm a woman who discovered crimes being committed against her and reported them. That's not revenge. That's citizenship. The courtroom was silent. The defense had nothing else. Allison stepped down, walked back to her seat, sat down. Jennifer Walsh gave her the smallest nod. You did well. The prosecution rested. Defense called character witnesses for Dylan. Friends who said he was a good guy, that this was out of character, that he'd been under stress. The prosecution decimated them on cross. Stress doesn't make you forge signatures. Stress doesn't make you plan to flee the country. Stress doesn't make you steal $70,000. Defense rested. Closing arguments painted two different pictures. Prosecution said this was a man who'd planned to rob his wife and abandon her. Defense said this was a man who'd made mistakes in a moment of weakness. The jury deliberated. 4 hours later they came back, guilty on all counts. Dylan's face crumpled. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. The judge thanked the jury, set sentencing for 2 weeks later. Dylan was remanded to custody. As they let him out, he looked at Allison, finally, for the first time since the trial started, and she looked back, held his gaze, didn't smile, didn't cry, just looked at him with those calm eyes that had watched him destroy himself. And then he was gone. Rachel, who'd been sitting in the back, left quickly, didn't try to talk to Allison, just disappeared into the crowd outside the courthouse. And Allison sat there in the empty courtroom for a long time. Jennifer Walsh sat next to her. You okay? Allison nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Dylan Cooper was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Bank fraud, wire fraud, identity theft. The judge had been harsh. Said Dylan had violated the sacred trust of marriage, had used his position as a husband to commit crimes against someone who'd loved him, had shown no remorse until he'd been caught. 7 years. Dylan had aged 10 in the courtroom. His parents were crying. His attorney was already filing appeals. But appeals rarely worked when the evidence was this strong. Rachel Parker, having already taken her plea, was sentenced to 5 years. Conspiracy, accessory to fraud. She'd get credit for cooperation. Might be out in 3 with good behavior. But 3 years was still 3 years. 3 years to think about what she'd done, who she'd hurt, what she'd lost. Allison walked out of the courthouse for the last time. The media was waiting. Cameras, questions. Mrs. Cooper, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think justice was served? Do you regret how you handled this? Allison stopped, looked at the cameras, and said something she'd prepared. I feel relieved that the truth came out, that the crimes committed against me were recognized by our justice system. As for regret, I regret trusting people who didn't deserve it. I regret not seeing the signs sooner. But I don't regret seeking justice, and I hope my story reminds people that betrayal isn't just about broken hearts. Sometimes it's about broken laws, and when it is, there should be consequences. That's all I have to say. And she walked away. Didn't answer follow-up questions, just got in her car, drove away, from the courthouse, from Millbrook, from the life she'd built that had turned out to be a lie. Betrayal happens. People you love will hurt you. Life will knock you down, but you get to decide what happens next. You get to choose whether you stay down or get up swinging. Allison chose to swing, and she won, not perfectly, not without scars, but she won. She survived, she rebuilt, she thrived. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all, living well, loving authentically, trusting carefully. and never ever letting anyone make her a victim again. This is the true story of Allison Parker, the woman who discovered her twin sister was sleeping with her husband, who found out they were planning to rob her and disappear, who decided that justice mattered more than keeping the peace, who fought back with everything she had, and who won, not just in court, but in life. Because 20 years later, she's happy, genuinely happy, and Dylan and Rachel, they're just shadows from a past she's left behind. Footnotes in a story that's ultimately about survival, strength, and the power of choosing yourself when everyone else has chosen to betray you. And that, more than anything else, is what matters, not the betrayal, not the revenge, not even the justice, but the life she built afterward, the woman she became, the happiness she found despite everything. That's the real ending, that's the real victory, and that's why this story matters, because it shows that even when the people closest to you try to destroy you, you can survive, you can rebuild, you can win, and you can do it without losing yourself in the process. You just have to choose to fight. And Allison Parker chose to fight, and she never stopped fighting. And in the end, she won everything that mattered, her dignity, her strength, her life. And that's enough, more than enough, it's everything.